to the entertainment Talking Sports.
What is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. As free agency will be here before you know it. So I figured I'd get started on some of my free agency videos. Of course, there'll be rumor videos along the way, and we'll start to hear some things. And the Giants may or may not elect to address the wide receiver position in free agency. After all, we all know we don't know how much cap space they're going to have at this point in time. They're going to have to get cute and move things around if they decide they want to go out there and add a piece in free agency. And they still got guys like Leonard Williams and Dalvin Tomlinson that they'll have to decide whether or not they want to bring them back. And those decisions will go a long way as to what the New York Giants could potentially do in free agency at the wide receiver position. If you were to bring back Dalvin Tomlinson instead of Leonard Williams, it would give you a little bit more cap flexibility, and maybe you go out there and sign a premier wide receiver. Something that I think we all agree on that the Giants will have to address, whether it be in free agency or whether it be in the draft. Darius Slayton this year, a guy I still like, a guy who maybe I think could be a good number two, I think clearly proved he is not a number one wide receiver at this point in time. Everybody points to separation. I'll go over which wide receivers are good at that, which wide receivers are not, that are on the open market. But the Giants did not create a lot of separation. They had a lot of drops, had the 8th most drops in the sport as a team, even though we attempted the 25th most passing attempts. Something needs to improve here. We need to get Daniel Jones more weapons. We need to be able to assess our quarterback going forward. Golden Tate will more than likely be gone, and that really leaves you with 2 wide receivers, that being Slayton, that being Shepard. I think that the goal will be to move Shepard to the slot and move Slayton over to that number 2 spot and try to bring in a number 1, or maybe you bring in 2 wide receivers. We'll have to wait and see how it all plays out. Maybe 1 in free agency, 1 in the draft. And some of the guys on this list I think would immediately come in and be the number 1 option. And some of the guys are more mid-tier options where if you bring them in, it helps stabilize your wide receiver department. But I still think you'll need to focus on it heavily early on in this year's draft. But let's jump right into it. Now, some of the guys that I did not point out before I show you guys that were some lower-tier options like Rashard Perryman. He's a lower-tier option that you could get on a cheap deal. The Jets brought him in last year. I think he's a former first-round pick, good deep ball threat. He's an option. Josh Reynolds of the Rams is a cheap alternative. I didn't bring up Sammy Watkins. He's another name that you could go over. Demarcus Robinson, a guy that we were rumored with last year, are some other names that I'm not going to go over in this video. But these are some of the names I will go over. I'm not going to go over Marvin Jones. He's on this list as well. PFF came up with a list of the top free agent wide receivers, and I'm going to go into their stats, more in detail in this video. But what they were able to do in terms of yards per route, run explosive plays of 15-plus yards, average depth of target, yards catch after the reception, and contested catches. They listed Chris Godwin, Kenny Gallaudet, Allen Robinson, Will Fuller, Juju Smith-Schuster, Corey Davis, Marvin Jones, Curtis Samuel, T.Y. Hilton, and Sammy Watkins. We'll not be going over Watkins, Hilton, or Marvin Jones in more depth. The other 7 I will. If you really dive into it, Allen Robinson is super impressive. He's 4th in the entire NFL. This is over the 2019 and 2020 season combined in explosive plays of 15-plus yards or more. He's also 1st in the entire NFL in contested catches with 44 over that same time span. Kenny Gallaudet is 3rd with 36, and Gallaudet is also 4th in terms of average depth yards of target, which adds up when you look at his, yards per reception. He's among the league leaders over the last couple of years. So those are just some numbers that I kind of wanted to go over with all of them. Godwin, to me, and I'm going to go over his numbers, is more of a slot wide receiver. The same can be said for Juju Smith-Schuster, which I don't mind adding, but not for top-tier price. I'll get into Curtis Samuel, I think could potentially be a fit for the New York Giants, and I'll jump more into detail with that throughout this video. But I'll go over the top 5 options, go over some of their accomplishments. First guy I wanted to pull up was Allen Robinson. First, I wanted to show you this stat, then we'll jump into some of his numbers. Robinson stands at 6'2". I think he's about 220 pounds, and he's been a super consistent wide receiver, and he's done it in less than ideal circumstances. You look at some of the quarterbacks that's been throwing the ball to him. You're talking about Blake Bortles. You're talking about now Mitch Trubisky, some of the worst quarterbacks the league has to offer. And since entering the league, only 64% of Allen Robinson's targets have been deemed catchable, which ranks 93rd out of 101 qualifiers. So about the worst. Literally the worst in terms of catchable passes, yet he's been able to produce at the rate that he has. And these are his numbers. He's a one-time Pro Bowler in 2015 in which he eclipsed 1,400 yards and had 14 touchdowns. Since then, he hasn't matched those numbers, but with the Bears and Trubisky the last 2 years, after sustaining an injury in 2017, he's rebounded nicely. He's had, 1147 and 1250. He's got 200 combined catches, 13 combined touchdowns, and he's been durable. He's played all 16 contests each of the last 2 years, and even with Trubisky throwing him footballs, has still been able to be one of the borderline top 10 wide receivers in the NFL. And I think he is certainly an attractive option. I think of the top tier guys, he is the best. He will be 28 next year, still in his prime. I wouldn't exceed 4 years with the ability to get out after 3, but I think he's a guy that would come in here and instantly improve this wide receiving core. And I think you'd still have to pay attention to wide receiver in the draft. You certainly would open up the option to not have to take a wide receiver early on in the first 2 rounds if you were to bring in Allen Robinson. It's a very deep class. You could probably snag one in the 3rd or 4th to try to continue to improve that part of this roster, which I think we all agree needs to be improved. But if you bring in a bona fide number 1 like Robinson, which I think he is when you factor everything into account, it definitely improves your wide receiving core. The question is, are you going to be able to open up enough salary in order to bring him in? Spot Track marks him at about $19.8 million a year is where they think his market's going to be. I personally don't think it'll be quite that high. I think with the shrunken cap, maybe you could get him for about 18, and it'll be the same for Kenny Gallaudet. These are Gallaudet stats. The biggest question for me with Gallaudet is, 1, a lot of people say he doesn't create a lot of separation. That's been a problem with a lot of the New York Giants wide receivers. 2, which is more my concern, it's injury history. The guy was hurt this year. He only played 5 games, and he's going to be 28 this year. So he's not the youngest of these candidates either. Now, where he fits, he is a big play threat. He is unlike any other wide receiver on this roster. He's 6'4". He could go up and get it. In 2019, he led the entire NFL while making the Pro Bowl in touchdown catches with 11 on only 65 receptions. More than 1 out of every 6 balls that he caught were in the end zone. And he averaged 18.3 yards a catch. For his year, he's averaging 17 yards a reception. He's a big play threat. He's a guy that could get down the field and make big plays for you, something that this offense desperately needs. And he's kind of similar, not that I'm saying he's as good, but similar to the type of receiver we brought in for Eli Manning in Eli Manning's 2nd year with Plaxico Burress. Burress was a total threat, a guy that caught a lot of touchdowns and gave him the ability to throw up a lot of jump balls and definitely helped progress Eli Manning throughout his career. So I think that's why a lot of Giants fans are attached to Kenny Gallaudet as a possible fit. Next guy we're going to talk about is Juju SmithSchuster. I'm not in love with Juju. I know he's had a lot of really good years in the NFL, mainly in 2018 when he made the Pro Bowl. He had over 1,400 yards, 7 touchdowns. He had 111 catches on 166 targets. Then he regressed last year in 12 games. Obviously, Ben went down, so you get that. They lose Antonio Brown. And then this year in 16 games, he only had 831 yards. He did have 9 touchdowns, however. I think he's a good wide receiver. I don't think he's a great wide receiver. And I think he's going to expect and command near top-tier money. Will he get 18? Probably not. But I think he'll be in that 15 to 16 range. And do I think he's worth that with his off-the-field baggage? You saw what he was doing on TikTok, and people were not enamored with him in Pittsburgh. I say no. I think he will be available. That's the other thing you got to question. Are these guys going to be available? I think Allen Robinson will be. Kenny Gallaudet, I still have my doubts. I could see the Lions franchise taking him. I think Juju will be available. But do I think the Giants should go out and get him? I am going to say no. I do not want Juju Smith-Schuster. He's more of a slot guy. He's a guy that does his work in the slot. I would rather have an exterior wide receiver. So he would not be my number 1 option. Next up, but beggars can't be choosers, Chris Godwin. Godwin, a lot of people, again, think will be franchise tagged by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But as of now, he is a pending free agent. Another guy that does a lot of damage in the slot. In 2019, out of his 121 targets, 100 of them occurred in the slot. I was unable to get the numbers this year, but in only 12 games this year, he did have 840 yards with Tom Brady and 7 touchdowns, coming off his Pro Bowl performance in 19, in which he played only 14 games and had over 1,300 yards and 9 touchdowns. There's no doubt about it. He's still young. He's going to be 25 years old, and I think that's where the value is. And if you were ever able to hit the open market, I think he would command upwards of $18 million because of his age alone and his production. So he's another name you want to keep an eye on. But again, I think Allen Robinson is far and away the best option of these top-tier guys. Next guy we're going to talk about, and the last of the top-tier guys, is Will Fuller. And Will Fuller, when he's on the field, is dynamic. But much like Kenny Gallaudet, and even more so with him, Injuries. You take a look at his career out of Notre Dame. 14 games his first year, then 10, 7, 11, and 11. Hasn't had more than 11 games played since his rookie year in 2016. He's been a constant injury-plagued player. Now, if you could get him on a short-term contract and a cheap deal, maybe you go out and do that. He's definitely an explosive player and is great with Deshaun Watson. Do I think you'll be able to do that? I don't know. You may have a desperate team willing to give him money. He's going to be 27 this year. Spot Track estimates he's going to make upwards of $16 million. And for that price, I'm not touching him. If you get him, like I said, on a cheap deal, maybe you start to entertain it because, he does have a ton of talent. This year, in only 11 games, he did catch 8 touchdowns, have 879 yards. 7 games in 2018, he had over 500 yards, was well on pace to exceed 1,000, had 4 touchdowns. He can't stay on the field, though. That's the problem with him. He does have 24 career touchdowns in 52 games, averaging almost 1 touchdown every other game. So the talent is there, but the availability isn't. So I don't think he's worth the investment that he probably will command somewhere. This guy, to me, is interesting, and a lot of Giants fans may scoff at this. This is mid-tier options. Let's keep that in mind. I'm not telling you Curtis Samuel is going to come in here and be the number 1 option for the New York Giants. If you were to sign a guy like Curtis Samuel, you're still going to address wide receiver early in next year's draft. Whether it be the first or second round, you're going to take a playmaker, whether it be a wide receiver, whether it be Pitts, or maybe you wait until round 2. Curtis Samuel, in my opinion, is not going to come in here and be a number 1 option for the New York Giants. But is he an interesting piece for a cheaper deal if you don't have the budget that you could bring in here and probably upgrade this wide receiver core? Yes, and I'm going to get into some of the reasoning as to why. He had 851 yards this year in 15 games. He also rushed for over 200. They used him in a running back role. He had 3 rushing touchdowns, 3 receiving. The year before, he had 627 yards and 6 touchdowns. He's not a guy that jumps off the page. One thing he does very well is create separation, and he's versatile. Something that Joe Judge likes, right? He talks about versatility. Also, in 2017, he was drafted by Dave Gettleman, similar to James Bradbury. Bradbury was a second-round selection by Gettleman. The Giants signed him. Samuel was a second-round selection by Dave Gettleman. Keep your eyes on Curtis Samuel if the Giants do not feel it is in the budget to go out there and sign a premier wide receiver, and they want to still address wide receiver in the draft and maybe bring in a guy that could add to this wide receiving core. One stat I really wanted to hammer home with Samuel, because I hear Giants fans all the time talk about the lack of separation from the wide receivers. Well, if you look to the far right of this chart, and this is since 2017, in 2019, Curtis Samuel actually ranked in the top 15 receivers in that time span in separation yardage. He averaged 0.24 yards of separation a play, which ranks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10th overall on this list. And you see some prominent wide receivers there. Beckham in 18, Amari Cooper, DJ Chark at the top, Travis Kelce, Robert Woods, Tyreek Hill, and Curtis Samuel right below him. So he creates separation. He's a versatile piece. He's not going to be, he's probably going to be lined up mainly in the slot, but Carolina really uses him all over the football field. He's 5'11". He's a guy to keep your eye out on if they're not going to splurge big. And then finally, a guy I've talked about in the past, and a guy I'm kind of lukewarm on. Again, he's probably in the same ballpark as Samuel. He's going to cost you around $10 million a year. Tennessee decided not to extend him before the start of the year. I think he's the former 5th overall pick by Tennessee. A guy that came into the league with very high expectations, that of course being Corey Davis, coming off a career year for him. In 14 games, he had 984 yards and 5 touchdowns. The thing that's alarming to me when you look at his game logs that jumps off the page for me, he's very hit or miss. He had 5 games this year in which he had over 100 yards, and 3 games in which he had 0 yards. So he's very hit or miss. Those 5 games account for more than half of his yardage for the year in those 14 games. But Davis is another guy that is a potential cheaper alternative to keep your eye out on. In the end, where do I think the New York Giants will go? If they go mid-tier, I think Curtis Samuel can make a ton of sense. If they go for a high-end wide receiver, I think Allen Robinson should absolutely be the guy that they go after. But again, it all comes down to availability, and it all comes down to which guys would want to come and play for the New York Giants. We'll have to wait and see how it all plays out, and if the Giants decide to address the wide receiver position in this year's free agency. But if they do, I think these are some of the names that you want to keep your eye out on. As always, guys, if you like what you watch, please subscribe. Drop a comment. Maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.